The International Association for Near-Death Studies presents NDE Radio, a weekly exploration of near-death experiences and similar encounters with the other side. Now, here's your host, Lee Witting.
Welcome to NDE Radio, brought to you by IANDS, the International Association for Near-Death Studies. I'm your host, Lee Witting. Our guest today, Laura Dunham, is a retired Presbyterian minister, now Catholic, and a Benedictine oblate. She holds a BA in social sciences and an MA and PhD in English. Following careers in higher education and financial planning, she felt God's call to ministry and attended Columbia Theological Seminary. She received an MDiv and later a certificate in spiritual formation from Columbia. Before retiring, Laura served as a pastor of churches and held leadership positions on nonprofit boards of directors. Her 2002 book, Graceful Living, Your Faith, Values, and Money in Changing Times, was commissioned by the Ecumenical Stewardship Center. In 2012, Laura published Path of the Purified Heart, The Spiritual Journey as Transformation. A new book, due out in September, is titled Extraordinary Time, Spiritual Reflections from a Season with Cancer, Death, and Transition. Laura, welcome to NDE Radio.
Thanks so much, Lee. It's good to be with you.
It's good to have you here. Laura, before we begin, I should mention you and I will be part of a chaplains panel discussion at the IANDS conference coming up later this month in Bellevue, Washington. As part of that discussion, I believe you're going to talk a little about some of the Christian mystics of history. And since a lot of our listeners won't be there, I wonder, could we begin by talking a little about Christian mystics and how they relate to near-death experience?
I'd be happy to do that, Lee. You know, the theme of IANDS this year is sharing the gifts of NDEs. That is, once you've had the experience and you reflected on it for a time, what are the gifts that it's brought to your life? How did you identify those, and how are you bringing them forth? So in light of that theme, I wanted to comment on the extraordinary experiences that people have had, such as NDEs or the spiritually transformative experiences, or STEs, as they might find a meaningful context in terms of being in conversation with the Christian mystics. These experiences are so unusual, and certainly in the case of NDEs, cause serious trauma, not only to the body, but to the spirit and the emotions and the mind, so that when one comes back from such an experience, it takes time to reflect on what has happened. We see that kind of reflection going on with Christian mystics, from Paul the Apostle in Scripture, to Julian of Norwich, to Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, up through our own time with Thomas Merton, for example. These are some of the mystics that I want to connect with in my talk at IANDS. But let me just start with Paul, because he's so familiar to so many people, on one level at least. But Paul truly was a mystic. He wouldn't have thought of himself that way, but the kinds of experiences that he had clearly show that he was chosen for a special role by God. And when he was knocked to the ground on that famous experience on the road to Damascus, everything was transformed in his life, just like people who've had an STE or an NDE. And what did he do? Well, he was blinded, and he had to heal from that before he could even speak or see. But then what did he do? He went out into the desert for a couple of years to try to find some answers. And his experience there bore a lot of fruit that he then brought back into his life and his ministry, because he knew that he was given a special charge. And from that point on, he saw visions, revelations. He had special experiences. At one point, he talks in the second letter to Corinthians about how he was caught up into the third heaven. And I know some of those who have had NDEs have had not dissimilar kinds of experiences, where you're taken to a place of light and love and beauty, and greeted by beings of light, and when you come back from something so extraordinary, you want to be in conversation with someone like Paul or someone like Julian of Norwich. So I'll just continue with that unless you'd like to interject something.
No, let's go on. I think NDEers love Paul because what he describes sounds so much like a near-death experience. But our listeners are probably less familiar with the other mystics that you mentioned. So why don't you go on from there?
Well, one that comes to mind is Julian of Norwich. Two of our keynoters at IANDS this year are Drs. Eben Alexander and Mary Neal. Both of them had extended NDEs so that they received a lot more input from the afterlife than many who come back more quickly. So these extended NDEs required even more reflection from them over the years. And they both wrote initial books that showed that they were having some challenges in kind of transforming from this rational scientific worldview to one that was more of the spirit, because an NDE is clearly a spiritual experience, and I don't think either one of them had the context to talk about that. In their second books, they've done considerably more reflection, and Eben Alexander went more toward consciousness studies and Mary Neal more toward evangelical Christianity, but brings to mind that a conversation partner for both of them might be Julian of Norwich. She was a late 14th, early 15th century mystic who was an anchorite. That is, she was contained in a cell that was set up for her in a church next to the Church of St. Julian in Norwich, England, after which she's named. And there were only 3 openings in the cell. One was to receive food and give back her empty plates. The second one was open to the church so that she could participate in Mass and receive the Eucharist every day. And the third one was open to the street, where when her window was open, she could give spiritual counsel based on her experience to the people of the town, people who came by seeking spiritual direction from her. When she was about 30 years old, she asked to receive the suffering of Christ. She asked for, she wanted to experience his passion, and she was gifted with 16 visions, which she retained and reflected on for the rest of her life. And she records these both in a shorter version and then in the longer version, 20 years later, you really see the fruit of her reflection and her prayer, her contemplation, because all she did in her life really was to pray and reflect on her relationship with God and Christ and want to draw closer to him in union, as so many of the Christian mystics do. That's their object. Not to have these kinds of extraordinary experiences. That's not it at all. Many of them have them from time to time, but this is at God's bidding, not theirs. And their purpose is to know and love Christ more deeply and to follow him more closely. So Julian's reflections, both immediately and then 20 years later, which were so mature and beautiful, just struck me that she'd be a great conversation partner for these 2 keynoters I mentioned, or any of our guests who have had NDEs. We might move on to Teresa of Avila, who's another well-known person who's written so beautifully of her own experiences. And she was a very practical woman, too. She was a Carmelite. She and John of the Cross, who was a friend and her spiritual director for a while, really, although they were both mystics, they both spent many, many years traveling around Spain, establishing new convents and houses for the Discalced Carmelites, more rigorous form of the Carmelite order, devoted to prayer and contemplation. That's their charism. And yet she wrote so beautifully about prayer. Her texts on prayer and on drawing closer to God in a book like The Interior Castle are just marvelous. And I was reading recently a letter that she wrote to her Carmelite sisters about the sweetness of Christ and how he came to her. She had these amazing ecstasies that would go on for long periods of time, and was observed in these when she would just kind of go out there out of body, and she was just united with Christ, in communion with Christ. And she talks about how sweet those experiences were and how they filled the soul, so ineffable and so beautiful. And they really help us to see what it's like to be in that kind of a communion, which is the purpose of the spiritual journey, that path of the purified heart that I wrote about, which takes us through transformation to moments of illumination like these that the mystics record for us, and then to the spiritual marriage, as the religious would talk about it, or the union of the soul with Christ, or some are more God-centered with God. Teresa's confrere, John of the Cross, is so interesting as well. He was more contemplative even than she was, and more austere in some ways. He wrote such beautiful poetry, the Ascent to Mount Carmel, the Dark Night of the Soul, and others, his spiritual canticles. And, when he and Teresa would get together to pray sometimes, and they would just levitate because the energy was so high when they were together. I can imagine, because I used to do spiritual energy healing, and it just being in that kind of energy, you'd probably lift off yourself. And John's expressions of the soul's progress through, these stages that I just mentioned, the purgation or purification of the soul, preparing itself to receive the illumination, the light of God, and then to be in communion with God. That's really what he wrote about for the most part.
So many people are familiar with the title, The Dark Night of the Soul, but some people in distressing NDEs actually experience a darkness and sometimes a fearful darkness. Maybe you could talk a little about what he meant when he said the dark night of the soul.
Well, John chose what we call the via negativa, the apophatic way, that is the way of emptiness, of negativity, of nothingness, of being willing to just to give up all connection with the material world in order to come with your soul bare before God and to commune deeply with God. There were two dark nights that he spoke about. The dark night of more of the beginners is the dark night of the senses, where you just feel cut off from God. Even Teresa of Avila had a very dry period that she wrote about. I mean, Mother Teresa in our own time spoke about the dryness that she had in her prayer life and so on. And yet she went on day after day after day with her works of charity, and eventually she passed through that. The second dark night, which you don't get to have until you've really moved down this path, is the dark night of the spirit. And that's the one that's more intense, and in which not only John but other mystics, like the 5th century mystic we know as Pseudo-Dionysius, speak of the brilliant darkness, that there's this illumination within the darkness that comes, that when we have quieted ourselves so that we can receive it, and that's something much to be treasured rather than feared. But few of us get to that point on this side. Remember, the mystics and other contemplatives have as their soul's purpose, really, this communion with God, and then bringing forth the fruits of that into their life experience.
The visions that Teresa had, some of them sound very much like the visions that people have had on near-death experiences. Describe what she saw as the setting for heaven.
Well, she talked about the 7 mansions of the soul. You go back to John's Gospel, when Jesus said to his disciples in his farewell discourse that, in my Father's house there are many dwelling places, or mansions in some translations. I go to prepare a place for you. And I think the afterlife is like that. And the medieval and early Renaissance mystics were very much into systems, and 3 of this and 7 of that. So the 7 levels that she talks about are really to be I think read and experienced. She doesn't really go into the last 3 because they're too mysterious and too hidden and really should not be talked about. I think a lot of people who have had NDEs and STEs have had difficulty talking about them. They're so ineffable, so noetic in the sense that you're in a liminal space between this dimension and that dimension, and it's not like anything you've experienced before. So finding the words to talk about it are difficult, and people don't believe that you've had it, although you'll always find some who understand what you're talking about. But you want to be able to have this context that I'm suggesting the Christian mystics can offer that will help you to, in your reflection, a deep reflection about what has gone on for you and why it's happened. I mean, how do you interpret your experience? What and who are your models? And for all of these mystics, and I can take us up to Edith Underhill and Thomas Merton in our own time. Love is the key to Christian mysticism. It's all about relationship, with communion with God, communion with Jesus.
Yes.
Wisdom, yes, knowledge, but other gifts like discernment and prayer and contemplation are part of the practices that bring us to this knowledge and wisdom, but also the experience of love. And I think that's really what Teresa experienced in her ecstasy. So I hope that will help others.
One of the things that has always struck me about near-death experiences, not only are they similar in many ways, but they are very personal as well. They're very personalized visions. Mm-hmm. And it's almost, when you mentioned Jesus saying he's going to prepare a place, it's as if some of these near-death experiences were specifically prepared so that the person going through a near-death experience would get the most value out of it, the most revelation, given where they were coming from originally. And perhaps, do you think those many mansions references are concerning a personalized heaven when we get there as well?
Oh, I think that's a very intuitive and deep question, Lee. And in my experience, yes, everyone's experience is slightly different, and we can participate in the creation of those as well. One of the other panelists on our panel at IANDS is my friend, the Dominican priest Nathan Castle. And in his work, he talks about this a great deal more, and I hope that you'll have an opportunity to talk with him on this show as well, so that people who can't attend the panel will hear from him. But his experience would certainly verify what you're talking about, that people have choice. I mean, we're given free will even in death, and as many NDEers know, you're often given a chance to choose to go on, to stay there or to come back. And some don't want to come back because they feel this intense, beautiful love that like they've never had before, or they've gone through the life review, they've gotten that far. And that kind of brings in the question of what we call in the Christian tradition last things, death, judgment, heaven, and hell. Well, judgment is always wrapped in mercy, and the life review is that experience of having a chance to see how you've impacted other people's lives, for better or for worse. And in the afterlife, to prepare yourself to continue the process of purification and illumination. So many of the experiences, I think, that are designed for us in the afterlife are exactly what we need to take us on in this continual journey of transformation and conversion that the religious and the monastics and the mystics talk about.
Where in the Christian mysticism experiences would you place the visions of Mary, such as Fatima and Medjugorje?
That's an interesting question. There's another one as well that I think is kind of interesting. I teach groups and lead retreats on the Christian mystics, and I'm doing one at St. Andrew's Abbey in Vallermo, California in January called Four Spanish Mystics, which includes Ignatius of Loyola, Teresa, and John, but also one called Maria de Agreda, who most people don't know about, but who is fascinating, 17th century Franciscan woman, and she received visions from Mary that through which Mary dictated her entire autobiography, which Maria de Agreda wrote up as the mystical city of God. So you start from that kind of thing, and your private revelations are kind of frowned upon in the church because they're hard to verify. And she was subjected to the Inquisition, to people in her order as well as, in the culture, really looking closely at her visions, the same way that Fatima and Lourdes and Medjugorje, I've been to Medjugorje, are need verification because of the perceptions of children or young people. Their innocence in a way, and the purity of heart is one of the reasons that Mary chooses them to come through. But they also need that kind of context that we've been talking about to interpret what they have seen and passed on. Others have interpreted that for them. But I think there are many of those kinds of legitimate revelations that come to people. Certainly, Our Lady of Guadalupe, in modern times, was huge. That revelation, and so many confirmations. It's the confirmations afterwards that are important too. I know when I had my own experience of being tapped by God to go into the professional ministry. It was so overwhelming and so clear to me that I couldn't believe it. There was no choice for me but to obey what I had received. But at the same time, I asked for confirmation, and I got it in some unusual ways. So, and part of the process leading to ordination in any denomination or part of the church is others confirming that you have the gifts, that you have received this call, that you are ready to proceed, and you continue to prepare yourself in many ways, to serve the Lord and to serve the church in that way.
One of the unfortunate things about many people who have near-death experiences is that they find their churches don't meet their needs. After the NDE, they drop out of organized religion altogether. Mm-hmm. Where is religion falling short, in your opinion? Why aren't their needs being met by the Catholics and the Protestants?
Well, I think it all comes down to spiritual formation. I think that there's a sad lack of spiritual formation across the whole church. I mean, serious, deep spiritual formation. This is the kind of thing that I have engaged with for years. After seminary, I did the certificate in spiritual formation because I wanted more and deeper. I began to walk with the Benedictines and became an oblate of that monastic order because I wanted more and going deeper in spiritual formation. And I found it there, and I find it in places in the church like, the whole history of Christian spirituality, which is a whole cut above what we usually hear about in the church. Most churches, kind of stop with baptism and new member education to the extent that it is. The Catholic Church at least has the teachings we call the rite of Christian initiation for adults that go on over a year to prepare people for baptism, as in the time of Augustine. 4th and 5th centuries and through the late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. It took a couple of years for people to be prepared for baptism, and they were, escorted out of the Mass, before the gospel and the homily in many cases for centuries because they weren't prepared to hear those things. Well, we're still not prepared to hear those things, but the churches aren't, on the whole, really offering much in the way of deep spiritual formation. That's been kind of my hobby horse for some time. And when I was living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, a few years ago, I got together with an ecumenical group of friends in that community, many of whom were spiritual directors and church leaders and other ministers. And we formed this ecumenical Friends of Christ School for Christian Spirituality, which is now going into, I guess, its 6th or 7th year, in order to offer people the basics of Christian spirituality, a class on the spiritual journey as transformation, a class on spiritual wisdom and guidance that introduced them to the saints and the mystics and the whole communion of saints, a class on practices for the journey, which introduced them to the basic practices of the Christian faith, like Lectio Divina, sacred reading, which involves meditation and contemplation, other forms of prayer, and so on. A class on discernment, which is such a crucial thing. Ignatius of Loyola had developed in the spiritual exercises, which I sometimes guide people through, on the way in which we discern what is of God, what is not of God, what is of evil or the dark side, or whatever you want to call it. And people don't have those skills. They don't have a rule of life to follow, even within the church, when they have experiences like NDEs and STEs. But I'm telling you, folks, it's there, and it's there in the Christian spiritual tradition, and we need to reclaim that.
You mentioned Thomas Merton, and even though he's had a Trappist background, which meant deep contemplation and meditation, he still found a lot of interest and value in Eastern religions.
He did, yeah.
And he drew on that.
Well, he did, and he was exploring Buddhism, as you know, at the time of his death. He was very interested in that, and there are so many at the highest levels of all the great world religions. There are many commonalities and significant differences. I think where the Christian tradition stands apart is in our personal relationship, our personal communion with God and the communion of saints on both sides of the veil, which is something that a lot of people are really searching for, that kind of spiritual companioning that's available to us. And I think a lot of people in our society who are not a part of any religious tradition or even a spiritual tradition are endless seekers, seeking through practices what they can't find in the culture, and yet they don't really have the whole tradition. They're not as familiar with it as they might be, so that they could be rooted in that tradition. So I think the deep rootedness and experiencing whatever the religious tradition is that they've chosen, the spiritual tradition, without just wandering from one spiritual practice to another is really going to be important for people's understanding as they begin to process these extraordinary experiences that we've all had.
Yes. Laura, unfortunately, we're just about out of time for today. And I want you to have the chance to tell the audience how they might find copies of your books.
Well, anywhere books are sold. My publisher, Cascade Books, will be bringing out Extraordinary Time, Spiritual Reflections from a Season with Cancer, Death, and Transition, next month, I believe. So look for it wherever books are sold. And also you can, there'll be a link on my website, which is laura-dunham, DUNHAM.com.
Very good. Well, thank you, Laura Dunham, for being on the show. I look forward to working with you at the IANDS conference later this month.
Well, thank you so much, Lee. I've enjoyed our conversation, and I will look forward to meeting you, too.
Yes. And I haven't had a chance to talk to him yet, but your friend, I'm hoping that he'll be available next Monday, and perhaps we can continue with the discussion that you and I have started here.
Well, you'll enjoy talking with him.
I look forward to it. If anyone in the audience would like to hear this show again or any of our past shows, just go to our website at nderadio.org and hit the past shows button. For more information about IANDS, including the upcoming annual conference near Seattle, Washington, please go to their website at IANDS.org. And please join us again next Monday, 11 a.m. Eastern, for more NDE Radio. This is Lee Witting saying thanks for listening.